detailed research on this topic and now has abandoned such flawed thinking. But indeed, the earliest interpretation of Revelation 12 has and always will be a Mariological interpretation. Further, on his blog we encounter a number of problems with Turretinfan's statements. This could stem from his ignorance of Catholic theology, because I seriously doubt that Turretinfan would intentionally mislead his readers. Turretinfan goes to great lengths to point out that, on the one hand, Rome teaches that Mary did not suffer birth pangs with Jesus. These are the marks that he says. And point two, on the other hand, Rome teaches that Mary was a woman of Revelation 12. And then he says a woman of Revelation 12 did not suffer birth pangs, and consequently he concludes that Rome's theology is contradictory. It is important to point out that Rome, as Turretinfan likes to call the Catholic Church, has not defined that Mary did not suffer birth pains. The Catholic Church also has not defined that Revelation 12 is Mary. So to call the Catholic's faith self-contradictory would only be correct if the straw man that Turretinfan has erected and beaten up was really the Catholic belief. And in reality it isn't. We can't be surprised at such incorrect studies being put forth. Mr. White, the director of AOMIN, himself has said, in regards to the Assumption of Mary, Roman historians admit that the first historical reference to the concept is not found in Orthodox writings, but in the writings of heretics, specifically in the Transitus literature of the late 5th century. Catholic historians, along with other historians, readily admit that historical evidence can first be found in apocryphal writings. Some of the earliest can be dated in the 3rd century. Expert historians in this field, without pinpointing a specific date, make the 2nd century as a more probable date for some of the Assumption narratives. Mr. White goes on by saying that this literature was condemned as heretical by the Bishop of Rome. You'd have to wonder if Mr. White had actually done his research, because that is not only correct, it is historically absurd. Mr. White then goes on to claim that the majority of Christians never believed in this. But this logic leads you down a murky path. Mary being assumed into heaven was a constant in the writings of some of the earliest Christian narratives. The Book of Mary's Repose, dated as early as in the 200s, can only be evidence of a tradition that dates to even earlier times. As historians who specialize in this field have suggested, this tradition, whereas unfounded amongst the writings of Orthodox fathers, is very likely to have existed since apostolic times.
Okay, Turretinfan, you now have 5 minutes to cross-examine Mr. Albrecht. You may begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much. The first question I have for you, Mr. Albrecht, is when did Mary die?
We don't have any evidence of when Mary did die or whether she didn't. There were a number of opinions among the fathers.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but if you don't know when she died, that's fine. Okay. When was she assumed?
We don't have evidence of the exact date when she was
approximately.
Approximately, we don't know exactly either. As I was getting to with the first question, the opinion of some of the fathers was that Mary didn't indeed die sometime before the 100s, and the opinion of some of the fathers as well was quite a few of them held to the fact that Mary was immortal as well. So as far as pinpointing an exact date of Mary's assumption into heaven, we really cannot pinpoint a precise date.
Even a decade? Can't even give me a decade?
As I said, more than likely a few of them believed it was before the 100s, but an exact decade, no. There are many things that aren't able to be pinpointed, but are historically true, and as such, this is another one of them.
So the answer to my question is no, you can't give me even a decade.
A precise date, no, I cannot give you.
And how about before the close of Scripture? Before the canon was closed.
Do I think that she was assumed before the canon was closed? It's a possibility, yes.
Okay.
Are you talking? Excuse me. Even though I can't ask the question, can you clarify? Do you mean before Scripture was canonized in its current form, or before it was done being written?
Done being written is what I meant. You understood that correctly when you answered.
Yes. Okay. I just wanted to be sure about that.
What was the location? Where did this take place?
There are various places that are pointed to. Some point to her being assumed at her house in Ephesus. Others assume that the location was some area that Christ took her to, and then she was transported into heaven. We don't know the exact location. There are quite a few details.
Do you even have a general location? Is it in Palestine? Is it in Egypt?
So some of them did indeed believe it was in Palestine, but an exact location, no, we do not have.
I'm really not asking for an exact location, just any location, any information about the location at all.
A number of Christians point to Ephesus. A number of Christians hold the tradition that Mary was assumed in Palestine. There isn't that it's not part of the dogma. There isn't one set position where we're forced to believe she was assumed here, or really any strong evidence of a certain location.
I'm sure you're aware that Jerome wrote an account of various famous happenings that took place around the Palestine area. If this assumption took place in that area, why did he leave it out?
Oh, once again, I never said that the assumption took place in that area. I simply said that there were a number of locations that were traditionally linked to being the location where Mary was assumed. But to answer that question, let's say that Mary was assumed, in Palestine. And let's say Jerome wrote a lot about what happened in that area. It's quite possible that Jerome simply didn't know about this. It was not in the early church, in the very early beginnings. It seems that not a lot of early fathers wrote commentaries on this. It wasn't as widespread as it later became.
Okay. You mentioned Revelation 13.
Revelation 12.
Revelation 12. And you had said in connection with Revelation 12 that this is you'd made some kind of connection to the assumption. My question to you is this. Are you aware of any church fathers that made that kind of connection? And if so, what's the earliest church father that makes that kind of connection between the assumption and Revelation 12?
With the assumption of Mary, the earliest father, I don't think that it's quite early, at least an explicit reference. In fact, I don't think that we can find a single father in the early church that connects Revelation 12 and explicitly affirms the assumption of Mary. But nevertheless, I believe that there were a number of early fathers in the church that when they connect Mary with being the woman in Revelation 12, I think it is some of them at least, the implicit affirmation that they believe that Mary was indeed assumed into heaven. Yet none of them wrote extensive commentaries on this. At least the earliest comment in Revelation 12.
And who's the earliest church father to mention the assumption explicitly?
The earliest church father to mention the assumption explicitly? Let me see. I'm trying to think. I assume not necessarily the early church father, but we can date the Book of Mary's Repose as dated as early as the 200s by some scholars.
But just a church father, please.
Church father, as far as I know, we can find the writings of Pseudo Melito, an unknown Christian, sometime around the early 300s. It's pretty much an unknown Christian. But as far as the specific name of a church father, that is probably the earliest reference. That church father is unnamed, anonymous.
Okay, Turretinfan, you now have your first negative constructive. You have 11 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chaplain, for moderating this debate, and thanks to Mr. Albrecht for your opening remarks. The question of Mary's assumption is twofold, historic and dogmatic. First, we'll consider the historical question as an historical question. Second, we'll consider the dogmatic question as such. Finally, we'll address some of the points of Mr. Albrecht's opening statements if we have time. First of all, then, the historic question. The historic question is the question, did this event actually take place in history? This is the same kind of question that is sometimes asked about other things that supposedly took place in history. Was Caesar really stabbed by Brutus, or was that something Shakespeare made up for his play? That's an historical question. Also, the question of whether Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried, and rose the third day is an historical question. To say that it is a historical question is to investigate the matter as an historian would. What is the historical evidence for or against a particular event? By way of comparison, we know about ancient events in a variety of ways. We know about the crossing of the Red Sea because of the account that Moses gives. We know about the crucifixion from the gospel accounts. What about the Assumption of Mary? We have no contemporaneous historical account and no references to any contemporaneous accounts in the historical literature. Instead, what we have is a legend that appears without